We have a one scripture passage today that's found in the Old Testament book of Judges. And I'll be reading Judges chapter 13, verses 1 to 24, which is all of 13. This is the story of Samson. Again, the Israelites did evil in the Lord's sight, so the Lord handed them over to the Philistines, who oppressed them for 40 years. In those days, a man named Manoah from the tribe of Dan lived in the town of Zorah. His wife was unable to become pregnant, and they had no children. The angel of the Lord appeared to Manoah's wife and said, "Even though you have been unable to have children, you will soon become pregnant and give birth to a son. So be careful. You must not drink wine or any other alcoholic drink, nor eat any forbidden food. You will become pregnant and give birth to a son, and his hair must never be cut, for he will be dedicated to God as a Nazirite from birth. He will begin to rescue Israel from the Philistines." The woman ran and told her husband, "A man of God appeared to me. He looked like one of God's angels, terrifying to see. I didn't ask where he was from, and he didn't tell his name, but he told me, 'You will become pregnant and give birth to a son. You must not drink wine or any other alcoholic drink, nor eat any forbidden food, for your son will be dedicated to God as a Nazirite from the moment of his birth until the day of his death.' Then Manoah prayed to the Lord, saying, 'Lord, please let the man of God come back to us again and give us more instructions about this son who is to be born.' God answered Manoah's prayer, and the angel of God appeared once again to his wife as she was sitting in the field, but her husband Manoah was not with her. So she quickly ran and told her husband, 'The man who appeared to me the other day is here again.' Manoah ran back with his wife and asked, 'Are you the man who spoke to my wife the other day?' 'Yes,' he replied, 'I am.' So Manoah asked him, When your words come true, what kind of rules should govern the boy's life and work?' The angel of the Lord replied, 'Be sure your wife follows the instructions I gave her. She must not eat grapes or raisins, drink wine or any other alcoholic drink, or eat any forbidden food.' Then Manoah said to the angel of the Lord, 'Please stay here until we can prepare a young goat for you to eat.' 'I will stay,' the angel of the Lord replied, 'but I will not eat anything. However, you may prepare a burnt offering as a sacrifice to the Lord.' Manoah didn't realize it was the angel of the Lord. Then Manoah asked the angel of the Lord, 'What's your name? For when all this comes true, we want to honor you.' 'Why do you ask my name?' the angel of the Lord replied. 'It is too wonderful for you to understand.' Then Manoah took a young goat and a grain offering and offered it on a rock as a sacrifice to the Lord. And as Manoah and his wife watched, the Lord did an amazing thing. As the flames from the altar shot up toward the sky, the angel of the Lord ascended in the fire. When Manoah and his wife saw this, they fell with their faces to the ground. The angel did not appear again to Manoah and his wife. Manoah finally realized it was the angel of the Lord, and he said to his wife, 'We will certainly die. We have seen God.' But his wife said, 'If the Lord were going to kill us, he wouldn't have accepted our burnt offering and grain offering. He wouldn't have appeared to us and told us this wonderful thing and done these miracles.' When her son was born, she named him Samson, and the Lord blessed him as he grew up. And the Spirit of the Lord began to stir him while he lived in Mahaneh-dan, which is located between the towns of Zorah and Eshtaol." May God add his blessing to the reading of his holy word. That's a lot. That's just the beginning of Samson's story. But it's important you know the background here, because that will help you understand the story of Samson and the words that I'm going to be talking about, mentioning regarding this story. Well, next Sunday, as you know, is Father's Day, and one father we seldom hear about is Manoah, the person I just read about, father of Samson. Little is written of Manoah, yet Manoah sought out God's will like a good dad. This was way back around 1000 BC. Manoah's wife was barren, and the angel visited her. And Regardless, you can bet that this got Manoah's attention. Anyway, the angel informed Manoah that his wife that they would have a son, and his son must not drink alcohol, must not eat unclean foods, and was not to have his hair cut at any point. All this because their son was declared by God to be a Nazarite. That is, an Israelite who is consecrated or dedicated to God, who takes a vow of abstinence for the purpose of dedicating their life to God. Samson was to be set apart by God from birth to the day of death. The angel let it be known that Samson would begin delivering his people from the hands of the Philistines. Philistines were very nasty, oppressive, violent people. Yet God had allowed the Philistines to conquer Manoah and his people, since the Israelites had previously turned away from God. And so Manoah and his wife were promised a son who would help defeat the wicked Philistines. And Manoah, being a good father that he was, did the best thing that a dad can do. He prayed. He prayed. His prayer was this: Lord, I beg you, teach us how to bring up this boy. How many fathers really pray like that? Teach me how to bring up my son. Later, Manoah showed honor for God by preparing a sacrificial offering and then falling on his face as the angel departed. That's basically the end of Manoah's story. That's all that's written about him. But it's biblical fatherhood, seeking God for answers, fearing God, being obedient to God's leadership. So Samson was born into a loving, God-fearing family with God's special blessing. Yet the story of Samson is a tragic tale of a gifted, arrogant, ungrateful wanderer running amok. A story of unimaginable potential squandered by selfish recklessness. But the story means so much more. Samson's story testifies that God's love and his promises are thoroughly trustworthy and unconditional. The Bible records that when Samson visited the Philistine outpost of Timnah, he saw a beautiful young Philistine woman. He promptly demanded that his parents get her for his wife. Parents had such authority back then. Samson, God's instrument for judging the Philistines, was actually seeking union with a Philistine woman who worshiped pagan gods. Well, of course, Manoah and his wife strongly protested. Not her. Choose among your own people, they said, begging Samson to pick an Israelite. But Samson insisted, saying, get her for me. I saw her, and now I want her. They eventually agreed to let Samson choose. However, even though they accompanied Samson to go find this woman, they were not happy parents. They were not very happy. Amazingly, the Bible states that even then God was at work weaving his plan despite Samson's breaking Moses' law against intermarriage with pagans. Yet God was not about to break his promise to Manoah and his wife. Samson would be the one to deliver God's people. Anyway, the 7-day marriage feast began for Samson. And Samson, likely intoxicated, another violation of God's law, made sport of the Philistines by challenging them to answer a riddle by the end of the 7-day wedding feast. He said, if you can solve this riddle, I will provide you with 30 linen garments and 30 sets of clothes. If you can't solve it by then you must provide me with those clothes. O vanity, thy name is Samson. Now on the way to his 7-day wedding feast, Samson had encountered a lion, which he killed with his bare hands. And then days later, when he saw the carcass, he scooped up honey which bees had produced inside the carcass of the lion, and he ate it. O grossness, thy name is Samson. Out of this experience, Samson created a riddle that only he could understand in order to humiliate the Philistines. And that's the riddle that he gave to the Philistines. And they had 7 days by the end of the feast to answer. And the riddle was this: Out of the eater, something to eat. Out of the strong, something sweet. Samson gave that riddle, and the people were just stumped. Nobody knew how to respond to this riddle. The Philistines had no answer to give. After the 3 days of this, the Philistines got a little frustrated and a little angry. So they told Samson's wife, you get Samson to tell you the answer to this riddle, or we're going to kill you and your father in his house. I'm telling you, these Philistines were not real gentle people. So this was no longer just an innocent little ancient version of Who Wants to Be a Millionaire. It was more like Marriage Reception Survivor. And they now had the answer to this riddle. And as you can imagine, Samson's new bride was quite distraught. And how did they get the answer? She threw herself on Samson, sobbing, and cried, you hate me. You don't really love me. You gave my people a riddle, but you haven't told me the answer. So she cried for day after day, like 3 days in a row. And besides, who would want to start their marriage off like this? So he finally gave in and told her the answer to the riddle on the 7th day. She told the Philistines, they gave Samson the correct answer, and Samson knew that he had been had, and he knew his wife was in on it. So he, in his anger, went out and killed 30 Philistines, which would give him the 30 garments, right? And then to pay off his wager, he gave those clothes of the dead Philistines to the Philistines who guessed the riddle. At that point, he was so mad at his bride that he took off without her, fuming all the way back to his father's house. Good old Manoah, first he let Samson marry against his will, and then he took Samson back in. And now, in the meantime, Samson's lucky new bride was given in marriage to one of Samson's bridegrooms, a Philistine. By the way, young men, let this be a lesson to you concerning wedding etiquette. If you leave your bride in the altar in order to wipe out 30 of her townspeople, don't expect her to have your dinner and newspaper waiting for you in the chapel. So anyway, despite his disobedience and reckless behavior, Samson found out he no longer had a wife waiting for him, and that her younger sister was offered to him as consolation by the father. He went ballistic and went on a rage, and he said, this time I will be blameless. In other words, I have the right to get even. And so Samson, picture this is true. Samson caught 300 foxes, tied them together at the tail in pairs, tied a torch to each pair of foxes, set the torches on fire, and then had the foxes, the flaming foxes, running through the fields of the Philistines, catching them all on fire. They were ripe for harvest. Talk about vengeance with a vengeance. He wiped out acres and acres of grain, proving he was the worst kind of arsonist, a foxy arsonist. I'm sorry. But the flabbergasted Philistines then retaliated against Samson by burning Samson's wife and her father to death, because revenge is never rational. The men of Judah, Samson's own people, had enough of this blood feud. They begged Samson to just leave. Samson was bringing all this trouble from the Philistines on them. And so they asked Samson, can you just please go away? Can you just leave? They even tried to turn over Samson to the Philistines, but he escaped and wiped out 1,000 more Philistines with the jawbone of a donkey. Those fickle Israelites were now so impressed by Samson's power, they made him ruler for 20 years. Needless to say, the Philistines wanted Samson's head on a stick, yet they were rightly scared to death of what God was doing through Samson. So after trying without success to ambush Samson while he visited a Philistine prostitute, they took advantage of Samson's new marriage to another Philistine woman named Delilah. They got her to agree to try and find out the source of Samson's strength so they could take their revenge and kill him. And she, like his first wife, did not know the true God. Plus, Samson didn't seem to feel the need to talk about God. So she badgered and badgered him, saying, What is the source of your strength, Samson? What's the source of your strength? How can you say you love me when you won't tell me, when you won't confide in me? Same trick the first wife pulled. The Bible records that she prodded him day after day until he was tired to death, so he told her everything. That he was a Nazirite, set apart by God, which was true, and that his strength came from his hair, which was not true. You see, Samson was no Rambo. His strength had always come from God. The long hair was just a symbol and a commitment as a Nazirite to God. And Samson forgot about that. So when Samson once again compromised his relationship with God and Delilah played barber, God had had enough. God's power left Samson. Samson was taken captive by the Philistines. His eyes were gouged out. A victory celebration was held in the Philistine temple, with Samson being the guest of dishonor. A blind Samson was paraded out in shackles to entertain the laughing crowd. Samson asked the guard to put him between two pillars so that he could rest on the pillars. It was at this point that Samson did something not mentioned until then. Samson prayed to God. He prayed to God. He was a defeated man. He was at his wit's end, but he finally looked to the true source of his strength. He even offered himself as a sacrifice, if it meant helping to bring down the Philistines. God responded. Samson pulled down the pillars which were holding the temple, and the temple fell, killing Samson and many, many Philistines. The Bible reports that Samson killed more Philistines in his death than during his life. And so God's judgment came against the Philistines through Samson. And it would continue years later through David, who, like Samson, was a flawed character, but used by God. This ends the pitiful yet powerful story of Samson, an otherwise average man, selected, set apart by God, blessed by God, but a man who squandered fantastic potential again and again. A born winner who chose to behave like a loser up until the very end. A prisoner of his own desires and ambitions. A man that was trying to defeat the corrupt culture around him, yet he became corrupted by that culture and dominated by the culture around him. A rageaholic, a sexaholic who thought of himself as above the law. So ironic how such a brave man who could overpower lions could not control himself. Yep, Samson and the Philistine culture didn't really stand out that much compared to the culture we live in, where right and wrong is less important than what's in it for me. The Old Testament book of Judges, chapter 17, reports that at the time of Samson, quote, everyone did what was right in his own eyes. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? And so what does Samson have to say to us? What can we learn from the story of Samson? Lesson 1, sin is a choice, and our sins always affect those around us. Samson couldn't get away with a dysfunctional family argument because he had a godly upbringing with good parents. Yet he chose to rebel against his parents and against God. He chose to disregard God, and his choices brought shame, consternation, even death to those around him. Samson's anger, his violence, his arrogance, his lust, it hurt everybody around him. It had a lot to do with what happened to the people around him. Whenever we convince ourselves that our sin is a private matter and it doesn't bother others, we are like Samson, blind. Samson was blind to this long before his eyes were gouged out. And so he stumbled on, and he reminds us that sin always affects those around us. Lesson 2, Samson teaches that sin and disobedience always affects us. It always comes back. Sin corrodes our relationship with God, and it corrodes us. Sin always leads to more of the same, more darkness, more blindness, more isolation from God, more guilt, more shame. Contrary to common sense, when you feed sinful appetites, you're growing them. Whenever you feed sinful appetites, they don't go away, they get stronger. They rage all the more. And following our appetites can result in sexual sin. And sexual sin is a companion of envy and confusion. Samson envied the freedom offered by the pagan lifestyle. When it comes down to it, that offer always promises more than it can deliver. Because there's no freedom in lawlessness. There's only more bondage. It slowly takes place, pushing out real relationships, real intimacy. It becomes an idol. Bad judgment, compromise, shame, weakness of character always follow pursuing our appetites, and sexual sin particularly. That's why God is so insistent that we, like Samson, be set apart from the culture around us. He wants us to be strong, focused on him, and pure from that rot and protected. This is why the Bible says in Philippians 4, "Finally, my brothers, whatever is true, whatever is noble, whatever is right, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is admirable, if anything is excellent or praiseworthy, think about such things." Now, God is not a killjoy. He wants us to fulfill our potential. He wants us to save us from Samson's fate, chronic dissatisfaction, self-destruction, lifelong goose chasing and shame. Strong man Samson was often extremely weak, very vulnerable. He just caved all the time when it came to resisting his rage, his violence, his lust. And so we need to realize that lesson 2, sin always corrupts and hurts us. And then finally, lesson 3, the story of Samson makes it clear that God truly can bring good out of any situation or person. He can bring good out of tragedy, good out of disobedience, good out of any sin. Samson ignored God, and God eventually left Samson to his own lifestyle and the accompanying consequences. But remember, in all of this, God loved Samson. God had made promises to his parents and his people, and God kept his promises. God had a plan, and that plan that through Samson, his people would be delivered. God always keeps his word. Despite all of Samson's blunders, God used him to achieve his plan. We must remember, no matter how bad the situation looks, no matter how far somebody has strayed, or how bad things have gotten, God can intervene. We must never give up praying and hoping and expecting for God to make a difference in the life of other people. We must never give up on another person. We must never give up hoping and striving to seek God's will. No one is too far from God's grace to be lifted up, be it the adulterer, be it the homosexual, be it the greedy swindler, the chronic liar, the child molester, or be it the selfish workaholics, be it those that are indifferent to the needs of others. We all of us, have gone beyond God's grace, but God reaches out with more grace, pursues us, and saves us from ourselves. All of us are beyond the pale. All of us are not worthy of heaven, but God goes the extra mile to make us worthy through what Jesus did on the cross. Samson was not chosen for his strength. He was strengthened because he was chosen. Samson was not chosen for his wisdom. Many days he was as dumb as a rock. And besides, his attitude was lousy. Samson brought nothing to the table except a hot head, shifting feet, wimpish character, wandering eyes. Yet God chose Samson. In fact, he was chosen before his birth. Samson's people were chosen long before the birth of their nation. As Christians, we are chosen people as well, chosen to know and represent the truth. Now, that's good for us, but it also must be good for all those around us. This is good news for everyone. We are in no position to judge anyone because God knows what God has in store. Who knows how a certain person might respond years from now or tomorrow? Who knows how God might use or strengthen someone, and maybe even to use that person to rescue you or to help you. Remember, the Bible tells us that God chooses and uses the foolish things of this world to shame the wise. His strength is made perfect in our weakness. So there's no cause for anyone to boast. Samson was no role model for us to follow. He was no hero. He was a common man with a boatload of failings, just like us. But he did leave us 3 lessons. Our sin is a choice and it affects others. Our sin always affects us. And God is always faithful and keeps his promises. So, Samson's worst sin was not lust. It was not anger. It was not murder. God can work around those things. Samson's worst sin was pride, rejection of God, for God cannot work around that. Samson was like the rich young ruler who approached Jesus asking, what good thing must he do to be sure of heaven? And Jesus reminded him that no one is good except God. So he better start depending on God right now for his salvation. Max Lucado, a famous Christian author, wrote about this sin of pride. He wrote, you see, it wasn't the money that hindered the rich young man. It was self-sufficiency. It wasn't the big bucks. It was the big head. Astounding, he wrote, how some people can stand before the throne of God bragging about themselves. The great trumpet has sounded, and these people are still tooting their own horns. Rather than sing his praises, they sing their own. Rather than worship God, they read their resumes. When they should be speechless, they speak. In the very aura of the king, they boast of self. What is worse, their arrogance or their blindness? Well, Samson was finally useful for God, but it took the loss of his earthly eyes for him to receive spiritual sight. Oh, that we might keep our eyes on God today and all our days to come. Let's take a few moments to be in prayer, shall we?